um, part 2 of our webinar series for Africa Month. We're commemorating the 20th anniversary of the Ezulwini Consensus, which is looking into the question of UN reform in the present, especially in light of current changes to the global community. Last week we had Ambassador Janet, the first Commissioner for AU Peace and Security. If you missed last week, it's up on YouTube, so you can go watch it at your leisure. And he discussed his experiences during the formation of the Ezulwini Consensus. In this week, we've got Ambassador Welile Nhlapo, who was South Africa's first ambassador to Ethiopia and the OAU, the predecessor of the AU, and he's going to share his insights into UN reform, yes, and the Ezulwini Consensus as well. Last week, Mpule Kgetsi was our moderator, and she's back again to do another great job this week. And then, similar to the format last week, if you were here, we'll be taking questions at the end. So if you have a question, please use the raise your hand function, and then also you're welcome to ask any questions in the chat, and we'll read them out to you. So Mpule, over to you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and a good morning to our participants today. I think this week we'll have a very good turnout because I see we're already at almost 40 people. Good morning to everyone and welcome to part 2 of our conversation as we'll be commemorating 20 years of the Ezulwini Consensus. And today I am having this conversation with, dare I say, a young person, forever young, Ambassador Welile Nhlapo, who, and I'm saying young because Ambassador is always, it's always in my corner, fighting for young people and, informing me about the different ways that I need to strategize when I represent young people. My name is Mpule Kgetsi. I am the African Youth Ambassador for Peace. I represent Southern Africa, and I'm happy to be, facilitating this discussion on your behalf. And as Catherine said, please feel free to be asking questions throughout the conversation. You may drop some of your questions in the chat if it's something that is burning and you'd like us to address it before we get to the Q&A section. But other than that, our format will be just as stated. We will have the conversation. Ambassador Nhlapo is somebody who has extensive knowledge on a number of issues, including the Ezulwini Consensus. I always refer to him as somebody who's been in every room. You can give him a date in history, any date in history, and he can tell you something about that date, what was happening, the time and where he was. So you are going to enjoy a very beautiful storytelling, the journey of the Ezulwini Consensus. So please make sure that you take advantage of the moment, you ask questions, anything that has been burning. And I see a number of the young people that I work with are in the room here today. We've been having conversations about the Ezulwini Consensus in different scenarios, especially what it means for us young people. So please don't hold back. He will be ready to answer all your questions. With that said, Ambassador Nhlapo, how are you and where are you?
I'm at home.
Oh.
And I suspect I am fine.
Okay. You're not sure, but you suspect you're fine.
No, because the doctors always prove me wrong, so I'm very careful.
Okay. Well, you look fine, and I hope you're fine. Thank you very much for joining.
Yes, I also prove them wrong all the time, so it's mutual.
Definitely. So Nhlapo, we have questions that we worked on and I'm going to be asking today, but because we have some participants today that were not there in the previous conversation when we talked about the genesis and the start of the Ezulwini Consensus, could you please start us off with that? Just briefly in about 5 to 10 minutes, just tell us in your own, from your own perspective, where did this conversation start? How did we start to talk about Ezulwini Consensus? What is it? What does it entail? So that people may know exactly what it is we're talking about today.
Yeah, let me thank you for the opportunity to engage on this matter. and greet all the young and old people who are there in the platform. I guess most of them are older than me, so I'll just say good morning. The issue of the debate around the expansion of the Security Council or its reform was sparked off by a document that was released by Boutros Ghali on an agenda for peace and agenda for development. There are quite a number of issues that were raised in that context, which also led to the Africans in particular, raising very sharply the issue of exclusion in a particular way from the Security Council, which deals most of the issues that are being on its agenda, which are unfolding and are confronting the African continent. And whatever effort that is being made by the continent, there's always a disadvantage in the fact that the organ that is charged by the United Nations is a Security Council. So therefore, if you are not in the Security Council in a strong way, then you are at a disadvantage. So that is the issue that was being raised, that it is about time that the Security Council in particular should be reformed to reflect the current realities, because in its composition and distribution of powers, it mainly took into account countries that were there when the United Nations was established, and therefore fashioned for themselves a particular power base around which they will then deal with issues of peace and security. And that was precisely the basis under which this was raised. So in 1994, in July, at the meeting of the OAU in Tunisia, the matter was then placed on the agenda for discussion as to how would Africa position itself on this matter. There were quite a number of serious challenges that arose. The conclusion was that maybe the best option will be continued rotation, no permanency. Now, part of the reason was that the countries that would have been possibly the ones that would raise their head to represent the continent in a permanent seat, if it's made available, was Egypt and Nigeria. And they were both at their weakest in a way. And therefore, the question was, there is no country that at the moment, at that time, that could represent the continent. But I must say, in all fairness, Nigeria lifted its hand as it continues to do so. The only country that unequivocally always indicated its readiness to be the country of choice that will represent the continent. Egypt was struggling in between at the time, hoping that maybe because of the situation within the Middle East and the issues around the Arab countries, and particularly the Palestinian question, in which Egypt was also playing a central role, that it might also possibly come in to represent, if there's a possibility for a seat to be allocated on that basis. That is for the Middle East. In the end, the consensus was that let's go for rotation. Everybody go for rotation. That debate went on 1995, 1996, particularly in the summit in Harare, where a decision was taken that the best way is to resolve this matter is to appoint a committee of 10 countries that will focus on this matter and come up with a proposal as to how best we can be able to take advantage of this opening when it comes, and be able to put forward proposals of how Africa should be included, and what our thinking is about areas of reform of the Security Council, its method of work, a broader representation, that is the elected members and also the permanent members. There was also the issue of the veto that had to be discussed. What happens to the veto? And that is why when the Ezulwini meeting took place in 2005, after lots of discussions that have been taking place trying to get towards a consensus as to what will be the best proposal for Africa. At the end, the meeting that took place at Ezulwini in 2005 resolved that Africa must vie for 3 positions at the time. That is elected position, it was 5, sorry, and 2 permanent seats with the inclusion of a veto, on condition that the veto is retained, but the preference from the continent was that a veto must be removed. And if it's retained, any member that joins must also be accorded the opportunity to enjoy the veto so that they can be equal as all the other members in the Security Council. That's what became the essence of the Ezulwini Consensus, and that is still the position even today. I will deal with the other debates that were there in between, but that is the fundamental principles that the consensus was agreed upon.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Nhlapo. So the consensus, ideally, even for us, for me, I've always known it as primarily dealing with the reform of the multilateral system, but more especially focused on the United Nations Security Council. But I've come to understand that there are other elements of the Ezulwini Consensus. It was not just about the Security Council and the membership and the veto powers, veto wielding members, the 2 that you mentioned. It was about other things as well. So I could you please detail that for us? What else did the Ezulwini Consensus deal with, and have we had any reforms that have already taken place because of the Ezulwini Consensus? And I'm saying this so that we kind of address that limited understanding that we have, and we also know, because so far we know that we haven't gotten anywhere, or we haven't gotten far in terms of reforming the Security Council to where we want it to be. But are we winning somewhere? Did it yield any results for us 20 years later?
Yeah, no, you are correct, Mpule, by saying it was not necessarily restricted to the reform of the Security Council, but that became a major issue, particularly at the time when intra conflicts were beginning to be a dominant feature in the nature of conflicts in the continent. And therefore, the transition that took place after particularly 1990, where a firm decision was taken with the formation of the central organ, that is the resolution that was taken on conflict prevention, management, and resolution. To unpack that, to try and have a more functioning approach towards dealing with the problems of the continent, particularly in respect of peace and security. But there were other issues that were of concern. The issue of climate change, for instance, desertification and drought, which was a major issue, which was also related to the question of peace and security. particularly in the Horn of Africa, which is what led ultimately to the formation of IGAD, Intergovernmental Organization for Desertification and Drought, and of course changed later into IGAD with a mandate for peaceful resolution of conflicts as the emphasis, and I think it's slowing down on the desertification and drought as a strong feature. There were other issues that were also on the agenda, the question of development for the continent, as to what exactly should the United Nations do? How do the United Nations must address the question of development? So the whole gambit of the multilateral system, as it impacts on the African continent, and the issues that were on the agenda of the United Nations at the time, are the issues that the continent focused on and sought to say, how best do we ensure that we position ourselves and that the processes of the multilateral system can also begin to talk to our own experiences and situations, and not focused on what has been primarily the concerns of those that started the United Nations and shaped its agenda, and trying to give meaning to the Charter as it was unfolding, with all the developments that were taking place, particularly after 1989, with the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Thank you, Ambassador. So from what I've gotten so far is that the formation of IGAD is one of the things that we've been able to achieve through the Ezulwini Consensus. Is that right? Have we had
No. I'm saying what was on the agenda at the time, amongst other things, was the issue of desertification and drought. Climate change, as we call it today, that the impact, because that what was devastating that region, the Horn of Africa, and it became an issue. And that's why there had to be a resolution on that, and it became a factor, and that's why later it became an issue that it was felt that it is also related to the whole issue of peace and security, because of what we had experienced in the Ogaden region in Ethiopia, with the desertification, drought, and the war that started between Ethiopia and Somalia at the time of Sirat Barre. That became another issue. That link could easily be established at the time, that you cannot separate some of these issues. You have to take some of those factors into consideration. The question of development, governance, although it was not directly engaged at that level, because you still had a number of issues, governance issues on the continent, where a lot of the countries, different governance systems, one-party states, military dictatorships, and then there were some that were emerging which could fit into the new description of the new world order that was emerging. And that's why in 1990, a decision had to be taken by the continent to reflect on the changes that were taking place in the world and their impact on the continent, and how the continent should respond. And in those discussions, the question of human rights and a lot of other issues that hitherto were never a point of discussion in meetings of the OAU, because amongst other things, of this whole issue of non-interference in the affairs of other states, which was a measure that was developed for the protection of those that had gained their independence but still surrounded by countries that were still under colonial domination. So it sought to protect that, but it stalled the issue of discussing challenges and problems that were taking place inside the countries themselves. And as most of them were gaining their independence, the issue became one that would have then been engaged, and the structures of engaging the issue of the borders, the decision on the inviolability of the borders, and the tensions around that, and the mechanisms that we put in place was to address particularly interstate conflict, because that is where the tensions were around the border disputes and the movements across. So with that evolution, it then became important to look at all the factors that contribute towards the nature of the challenges that the continent was facing in relation of human rights, that is governance issues, peace and security and development, and look at the linkages between all of these processes and begin to say, how do we then begin to deal with this process in a holistic way? So the agenda for peace and agenda for development gave the opportunity to broaden the scope of engagement by African countries within the United Nations, and particularly the committees of the General Assembly, where those issues were then packaged in segments in which they will be dealt with within the United Nations. It was really for the continent to reposition itself. And the Ezulwini Consensus took into account all of those developments, but focused particularly on that one, which was the real weak spot in terms of dealing with issues of governance and development. It was the conflicts what we're placing, intra-conflicts within the continent that needed to be managed in a particular way, and that's why the mechanism had to be adopted in 1993 and put into effect in 1994. That's why many things happened around 1994. At the time when South Africa entered or was accepted as a member of the African Community of Nations.
Wow, that's very insightful, and I think we're having an appreciation of then the different developments that have happened because of the Ezulwini Consensus. I think for me, I've come to understand that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that the Ezulwini Consensus was one of the first instruments around what we now call as the Common Africa Position, right? It was the first Africa position statement, right, on a particular issue on the reform of the multilateral system, particularly the United Nations Security Council. And I know that recently, speaking about climate change and looking how far back we started talking about climate change as a continent 20 years ago, we recently adopted, or in the process of adopting as the African Union, the Common Africa Position on climate change, the relation between climate change and peace and security. So I think it's one of the ways that shows that we're making change. It's slow, it takes a long time, it took 19 years, but there is change in the horizon. Speaking of change, I wanted to ask, Ezulwini Consensus, we were talking about it 20 years later, and the world has changed a lot since then, and the views of people around multilateral institutions are not the same, you know. They're very different. We have a new generation of young people that view our institutions differently. They're disenchanted by them, and you know, they don't see the same importance that was there 20 years ago for us to be you know, part of the discussion and part of the discourse. So I wanted to ask, do you think the proposals that we made back then for the Security Council reform as outlined in the Ezulwini Consensus are still relevant today? And I'm asking because somebody recently asked me a question asking that why are we so pressed about why do we demand to make reform to institutions that we didn't form? And, you know, so that's why I'm asking, is it still relevant today, the proposals that were made 20 years ago?
Yeah, that's a very interesting take, because there are very many of these international or multilateral institutions that were not there when they were formed, but we became part of them. And that is a reality, and it was a voluntary decision to join them because of the collective effort that we wanted all of us to contribute towards ensuring that never again should there be another world war. That was a major concern because Africans were directly affected and did participate as part of the colonies. They sent forces to go and fight in this war, although that is not necessarily recognized and was not factored in the formation of the United Nations. The emphasis was on the primary role of what was called the allies, but not the colonies that they took with them in fighting that war, because we did participate. And it's something that needed to be corrected, because we had a stake. It was a world war, second world war. And we participated in both as Africans, drawn in from the colonies. It's only recently that that recognition is coming to bear. But if you look across, you'll find, for instance, the British, where Africans or the colonies were involved, you'll find graves in those countries, particularly North Africa, those that fought against Mussolini, the Italians, in Ethiopia, in Eritrea. You find memorial graves that are there. And in some other parts where Africans perished, you find the same with the French. A lot of Algerians fought alongside the French in the World War, particularly the Second World War. Senegalese. So I'm saying that it was a war in which we were associated with, and finding the solutions excluded us because those that came together decided to come together as independent sovereign states in terms of the definition that was being applied at the time. And there were only 4 African countries, by the way, that participated in the formation of the United Nations. Only 4. It was South Africa, strangely, as the Union of South Africa. It was brought in. It was Ethiopia. It was Egypt. I think Liberia, if I'm not mistaken. But there were 4 African countries that participated in that meeting and the founding of the United Nations. The rest joined post-independence. Now, that is one thing. The second one, let me go into the issue that you had also, question that you've also raised. The issues that were raised at the time are still relevant today. Because if you look at the agenda of the United Nations in its broad nature, and particularly the agenda of the Security Council, most of the issues that are being debated there are issues that are related to conflicts in the continent. More than 51% of the agenda of the United Nations Security Council is on Africa. In various forms and various issues that have been coming up and focusing on how best to respond to those challenges, including peacekeeping. Africa hosts the largest contingent of peacekeeping. of the United Nations. The African Union itself, under Chapter 8, like other regional organizations, have had a fair share of deploying and dealing with conflicts on the continent on the basis of the United Nations Security Council allowing them to do so, because it is still accepted that the fundamental mandate for maintenance of international peace and security will be the Security Council of the United Nations. But Africa sought to find a possible way of ensuring that there is a partnership between the structures that it was developing to deal with its conflicts that were placing on the continent, and not just depending on the United Nations or come in as part of the United Nations deployments, but also to take the responsibility, not to forge a working relationship with the United Nations Security Council, particularly at the time of the formation of the Peace and Security Council. The lines became much more clearly defined in terms of the cooperation that should be brought into place. And we've seen that playing itself out in the case of Burundi, in the case of the Sudan, UNAMID, and of course, in the case of Somalia. Again, under Chapter 8, where the African Union took the initiative, but the deployment was under Chapter 8 of the United Nations Security Council, or Charter, with the support of the United Nations, and then that deployment could take place. But because of funding and other complications, that partnership became very important and necessary. But there was a challenge throughout, because the United Nations, particularly the Security Council, rightly so, but unfairly so to an extent, sought to take it upon itself, because of past colonial linkages to the continent, on the false basis that they understood the problems better. They created some of them, it's true. Although sometimes we talk about African solutions to African problems, but some of the African problems that we are talking about were created by the colonizers themselves. And at the time of independence, they left us with constitutions and situations that were much more complex. And the Cold War made things even worse, because Africa became the theater of the Cold War, and was still trying to untangle some of the consequences of what happened. So they cannot claim to be immune from some of the problems that have happened, but we cannot keep on harping on that. We have to find a partnership and a way of dealing collectively with these situations. And that is why all those processes had to be, at least all those engagements had to take place. The issue of the expansion of the Security Council also became a challenge. We now have 3 elected members in the 10 elected members of the Security Council. It did not come easy. It had to be a struggle to get these 3 seats accepted, so that we can be able to participate directly within the Security Council itself as the A3 to represent the interests of the continent, without, of course, the veto, because there is no permanent representation. But we're able to raise the concerns of the continent in the manner in which the Security Council has been dealing with the issues and some of the conflicts that have been taking place in the continent. and we became a much more of a critical voice. And even in the methods of work of the Security Council, one of them, which is still a particular problem, is this penholder issue, where some certain countries have abrogated to themselves to be the ones that lead the processes as penholders, as they are called, because they are the ones who initiate the drafting, who initiate the negotiations towards any resolution or statement that will come out of the Security Council. And in many cases, it is the former colonial powers, again, who abrogated to themselves that responsibility. And even leading delegations that go to the conflict zones to appraise themselves of the reality of what is happening, and therefore taking the lead completely. And Africa expected to follow and comply. And that has been quite a struggle. To some extent, once or twice, we've been able to demand that we lead delegations of the Security Council to the areas where the conflicts are taking place, so that we can be able to be part of those who determine what should happen, to have a much more of a stronger voice. So we've got the A3. There are still challenges even there, because as the A3, we are supposed to implement decisions of the Peace and Security Council or of the head of states and government summit on issues that are related to Africa, where common positions emerge within the AU. It started at the time of the OAU. And this concept of common positions, it was to ensure that there's adequate consultations and an agreement amongst Africans, so that we can go as a bloc and be able to present our situation, so that the divide and rule that we're beginning to experience, which still continues, does not perpetuate the weaknesses of our representation within the Security Council. And therefore, the determination of the agenda, as I've said, as to what goes onto the agenda, we are now in a position to place issues on the agenda, chair those meetings from time to time, and be able to give some guidance. But on some issues where these powerful countries have got an interest, it is not always easy, but we have to always navigate that situation and try to find the best possible position that we can get adopted by the Security Council, and actions that can be taken by the United Nations in addressing or dealing with those particular conflicts.
Thank you.
To
Thank you
that,
so much.
onto the issue of the methods of work, which is still work in progress, because there's a lot that needs to be done. Because as you would appreciate, at the moment, there are many issues that are taken up at the level of the Security Council, but with no resolutions. It's only statements by the chair of council to confirm that the meeting took place, what was discussed, and what was the consensus or the issues that came forward. A lot of them is through statements and no resolution, which makes it a permanent issue that will be dealt with continuously within the Security Council. So most of the issues suffer precisely because of the manner and the methods of work that is applied, and the nature of the negotiations that take place because of this penholder system.
So, Ambassador Nhlapo, for the A3, I think you mentioned earlier that there's a rotation, right, for the countries that make up the three countries that represent Africa. So how is that selection? How does it go? That selection process for which country will be representing us at a particular time?
It's on rotation on a regional basis.
Okay.
That's why the 5 makes sense, because we've got 5 regions.
Yes.
We only have 3 elected seats. These are the countries that are agreed upon from their regions on the rotation basis by the AU, and then taken up with the security, with the General Assembly, which is the one that elects those members into the Security Council, 10 of them, 3 from Africa. That is the basis on which things are happening at the moment.
Okay.
But that has been the case. The permanent members of the Security Council always have a say as to who comes in. There are countries that from time to time they do disqualify, which the continent could have been agreed upon, or the region, particularly because some regions have got very serious challenges and intractable conflicts that are taking place, and therefore whenever they might want to offer a representation from their part, there are always challenges that they are part of the problem. But I think that is also improving. It's a situation that incrementally we're able to demand that equal consideration should be given to any member of the United Nations, particularly because it becomes a process within the General Assembly where everybody has got an equal vote, and there is no veto power there.
So our agency is still limited, even in terms of who gets to
Our
represent us,
agency is
because
still
there are certain
limited
members
because, yes, because there are certain practices, some of which I don't want to necessarily go into, but the abstentions or absenteeism, where some countries just simply absent themselves from the voting process because of pressure from the donor countries. That becomes debate. You go this way, then you have to consider that in the process we are still dealing with a request that you have made. We are trying to support you on your budget or any other issue related to development or social issues that the developing partners get involved in. And that becomes a leverage sometimes that they use to put pressure on African countries not to vote, or sometimes even to break the common positions. It has happened. So we're still struggling to find ourselves even on ensuring that once there's a common position taken, that common position will set, that there will be no pressure brought on any member to behave or vote differently. It's still a challenge that we have.
Okay, so I have one final question for you, Ambassador Nhlapo. But before I get to that question, I wanted to ask you, just as a side note, your view on this. Do you think that the P5 would ever let us up and give us the 2 other seats that we've asked for? The 2 veto-wielding membership seats. Do you think that will ever happen? Because I know that is the one thing that people are always vying for and looking out for. In your opinion?
4 of the members have pronounced themselves on the 2 seats, except for China. China, they made a broad statement that indeed there needs to be an expansion for Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, and the Caribbean. because there is a particular challenge that they have in Asia with Japan and India, who've got an interest, and China has not come to terms in agreeing with whether they can also be considered. So there is a particular regional issue there. Africa might be having those issues which are silent, but they come up from time to time in terms of opposition to whoever might be willing, particularly when the names are being mentioned by the big powers. They have a tendency of making choices for Africa, saying that, well, so-and-so might make a good candidate for a permanent seat, and that thing, that becomes a source of tension as to why certain countries are being favored. In 1998, arising from the decision of the summit in Harare, 1998 in Ouagadougou, the C10 presented a criterion that could be considered for countries that the continent might want to look at, who would then represent the continent if we are able to get the two seats. That was the basis, that we need to continue to consult and make sure that we define things ourselves, because there was a process and a tendency for some criterion to be defined, which would impact negatively or affect the decision making on the continent. But there could not have been agreement on that one. It was said, no, let's get the seats first. After getting the seats, then we can decide on that one. On the issue of the veto, none of the permanent five want to entertain any new entrants on a permanent basis acquiring and wielding a veto. That one is a no-go of all of them. Silently and privately, they tell you point blank, forget about that one. So we still have a long way to go in the achievement of that one. But it does not mean that it should not be dealt with. The trick here is that if there has to be any change in the basic document of the United Nations, the Charter, you'll need, particularly when it comes to the Security Council, you will need 75% of the members, plus or including the P5 agreeing. So they will still have the veto as to whether you can have any amendment to the Charter, particularly Chapter 108, which deals with the question of the Security Council. The chances are that they will then coalesce and take a position that they are not going to allow it, on the basis that if one objects, they all then join in, and then they'll play their games as usual, but they'll want to retain that position. At the moment, none of them is willing to give up the veto, which was the first option that we had proposed. And there's some other countries and consultations for coalition of countries who are raising the same issues from a different angle, coming from together from different continents, who are saying, no, let's do away with the veto completely. And others saying that, no, let's look at how we can change the baseline for amendment of the Charter. It's going to be an uphill. It's not going to be easy because of the balance of power within the United Nations. We still have a long way to go on that one, but it doesn't mean that it should not be attempted. It's better to go for it and fail, but if it becomes clear, because it's a numbers game, that this is going to be untenable and there is no agreement, particularly amongst the countries of the South who stand to benefit from any changes that will take place. It means the Caribbeans, Latin Americans, the Asians and Africans got to agree now with the differences between us internally and amongst us. It's not going to be easy to reach that point. What happened in Brazil at the meeting of the BRICS, of the ministerial meeting of the BRICS, where this matter was broached, which was unfortunate because that was not really the right platform to do so, to try and get support for India, Brazil, and South Africa into the permanent seat of the United Nations. Ethiopia and Egypt opposed any decision that can be taken by the BRICS on that basis. And correctly so, because the continent is the one that will have to decide on its representation. So it's a very tricky and touchy issue. You can't get any shortcut anyway. You've got to stick to where and how it is. Another issue that we still have to iron out, which is still hanging, is the use of a veto. The silent decision up to now is that before any country that will represent the continent on a permanent basis wields the veto, there must be consultations with the continental body. Now, it's again a weak position. You have a secondary membership where sitting there with your peers in the permanent seat, you can't take a decision unless you have to consult with the continent. So these are some of the issues that we still have to go into and discuss. But up to now, the position has been, let's get the seats first. Once we have won that one, then deal with the question of the veto. And once we've got the issue of the veto, some countries are beginning to say even now, maybe we have to forget about the veto and focus on the seats. Get the seats, and as time goes on, and then we go, on an incremental basis, piece by piece, try to claw this elephant so that we can begin to join the feast with the rest of the others.
Yeah, it does seem like an uphill battle from where I'm standing. And for a second, when you mentioned that there's a hanging issue, I thought you were going to talk about the issue of if we do ever get those two seats, who in the continent will get it. So I know that's a discussion for another day, because I know that's something that the consensus has agreed
it's a
on.
hot discussion, and some countries pronounce themselves very strongly.
Yes.
That the two that are most of the time touted, it was pronounced in a summit here in South Africa that they can forget because they were part of the Security Council when the decision on Libya was taken. That they must forget. They cannot be trusted.
So which countries are those?
You know that Nigeria, South Africa, and Gabon were in the Security Council at the time.
I needed you to say it.
Yeah, but the issue was directly at South Africa and Nigeria. Unfortunately, it was the late former president of Zimbabwe. It's on record. It's not gossip. It's on record. He said it in his closing statement after thanking the president of South Africa for not allowing al-Bashir to be detained as per the court order that was issued at the time. It was around when these issues were brewing and hot, but in his closing statement as the chair, of the AU. That's what he said. And that has always been the position of Zimbabwe, by the way.
Wow. Okay. So yeah, the two countries that have been vying for the positions, they can forget about it. We have
that's what was said
yes.
by him. That didn't forget that there might be others who have the same sentiments, that those who have lifted their hand already should not be acceptable. By the way, South Africa, when we went 1996 to the debate, the summit in Harare, where the matter was going to be on the agenda, we met the heads of multilateral institutions to look at the implications of what this thing means. And part of the reason why we did so is because on a state visit, Prime Minister Blair raised the issue of a preference for South Africa to be a candidate for Africa, created a problem for us. Clinton did the same thing when it came, until Mandela had to object. He said, no, you can't take a decision for us. But that in itself, the fact that these two big powers had already shown a preference without even consultation for who they think will represent the continent better, what their preferences are, and making this openly at a closing press conference of a state visit, creating an impression that this is what issues that was discussed and agreed upon. So we went there, and at that time, between Nigeria and Egypt, to use that thing, a phrase that might explain it all, there was blood on the floor. And that's why the C10 had to be empowered to go deeper into looking at this thing, because it was quite clear that unless we are able to deal with this matter, it's not going to take us anywhere. That is what led to the meeting that took place, by the way, at Ezulwini, at the summit, the meeting that was convened by Swaziland, at Ezulwini, where the Ezulwini Consensus was decided upon, because it was becoming clear that it is difficult to engage on this issue and arrive at a position that we'll all be comfortable with, because the same processes were taking place within the UN. There was a certain declaration that also came up in the reinforcement of Ezulwini Consensus. And therefore it became an issue when the AU was established, because a certain declaration which re-emphasized the importance of the Ezulwini Consensus and the need to sustain and maintain it as a position of the AU.
Okay, so I see a hand from Yimovisa Collins. The hand has been up for a while, so I suspect it must be a very pressing question. Yimovi, can you please very briefly, because I still have one more question for Ambassador before we go into the Q&A section. So this is not the Q&A section yet. So Zinka, I recognize your hand. I will take you after my final question. So Yimovi, in 1 minute, could you please unmute and ask question, comment? Are you able to unmute? Okay, that's fine. We can proceed. I will give you another opportunity to ask your question during the Q&A section, because I see, please, Yimovi, please unmute. Okay. I see your camera, but I don't, you're still muted. So I don't know if you're. Okay, we can proceed. Like I said, you'll have another chance during the Q&A section. So, but please make sure at that time you are able to unmute, your mic is connected and all of that, because I think you may be experiencing some challenges so that you may be able to ask your question. So the last question from me, Ambassador Nhlapo, as we now wrap up our discussion before now people also give their take and, ask you questions, because I'm sure there are a lot of questions, is Africa's, you've mentioned some of this, our current position in the global community. How do we then keep the consensus, the Ezulwini Consensus relevant, especially, those demands? You did say that they're still relevant. The issues that we deliberated on back in the day, 20 years ago, that we put on the consensus, they're still relevant today. There's still issues that are quite pertinent and they affect us as a continent. But now looking at, young people, how do we make sure that it's still relevant for them? Because they're the ones that I think are experiencing the most, the identity crisis of not really relating with the institutions, really feeling like the institutions don't serve them so much. And the discourse around, should we really be reforming the institution, for them, it's a touchy topic as well. Them feeling like, well, let's deal with our own institutions and not have to go outside that and not have to pressurize ourselves. Looking at the fact that this conversation has been happening for 20 years, how many more years do we have to go? And as you were talking about, the 2 seats right now, I was even feeling more dreadful, thinking, I don't think this is something we're ever going to achieve. So should we continue? So what's your take on that in terms of whether it's still relevant for young people? How do we keep it relevant for the young people, being a young person yourself?
Yeah, as one of the young people, I boldly want to state that we should sustain this position, because if you shift from it, what we can't get is 3. And what we can't get again is more than 5 in terms of the elected members, what is normally called the rotating members, elected members. I think it's quite a reasonable demand that we should stand on, and that has not been questioned because of the nature of the size of the continent and its representation within the United Nations, and the fact that most of the challenges that are being dealt with within the UN, and particularly the Security Council, arise out of processes and challenges and conflicts that are taking place on the African continent in the main, including peacekeeping or peace building, whatever the issues are. So I think that has been acceptable. For me, any shift away from the expansion in terms of numbers would be to play into the hands of those who are resisting. Because once you open that one, so far that has not been challenged. Once you want to open it and want to be elastic about it, you might end up with a problem. Where we need to be, at some stage, careful as to what extent will be a do or die position, will be on the question of the veto. If it's becoming increasingly clear that that one, for that particular movement, is not going to fly, it might not be useful to want to fight on that one if everybody else says, okay, that's fine. And you don't want to lose on an issue where a consensus is emerging and get punished on what you want. Precisely because you became a problem, quote unquote, in the process of trying to arrive at stabilizing the mechanisms of the United Nations in dealing with the challenges that were faced with as this globe, particularly in the current shifts that we're seeing in terms of geopolitics. It's a touch and go, and I think it's an area that one has got to take all of these sensitivities into account. There is no space for gambling. Stick to what for now is acceptable, but make sure that we engage. It should not just only be a matter for governments. It must go and be a matter for discussion and understanding for the people that we represent as governments, the people of the United Nations, as the Charter says. You know, the first sentence in the Charter says, we, the people of the United Nations. So we have to take the United Nations back to the people. There has to be those consultations on some of these thorny issues because there will be implications, even in terms of financial implications, in terms of commitments that demands that will be placed on countries if they want to get to this position. It means we have to make particular sacrifices and contributions. We're seeing it even right now with the elected P3. Some of the countries are struggling because we have to build the capacity to engage in the processes of the Security Council and focus on that. And some countries are very thin at the UN because of resources, and they are not adequately in a position to make sure that they can push. So there are all of those aspects that are involved. And I think those are the issues that we have to take into account. That's why the issue of the criterion became important. What is good is that in July last year, a meeting was convened by the Peace and Security not convener, the Ambassador Bankole convened a meeting of civil society organizations for consultations before a ministerial meeting that took place in Algiers to consider the outcomes of a Security Council meeting that had taken place and in preparation for the summit of the future, because the draft document was also pronouncing itself on some of the issues that we have taken positions on in the Ezulwini Consensus, and as we're engaging in the processes of the UN, the consultations that are taking place across the board. And if you look at the outcomes of that document or that summit of the future, you can see that we're still way back towards achieving our goals. There seems to be a shift on some of the issues, development being pushed to the background, and then trade assuming more of a priority. And this is what the developing partners are saying. That's where the issues like the UNDP and other structures of the UN that we know might begin to suffer or even be completely removed. And the discussions that are taking place now with the staff associations in Geneva and New York in terms of the reduction of staff and moving some of the operations of the UN, particularly humanitarian agencies, from Geneva to less expensive countries. Kenya has been one of them that has been pointed out. Rwanda has volunteered to take some of the countries. There's one country in Asia that has also raised its hand. So there are all these discussions and debates that are taking place. So by the time these issues are finalized, the United Nations, as we know it, as it is structured today, might be completely different. And this September might begin to paint the way forward And that's why we'll have to watch everything that is happening. Continue with our consultations, but hang on to what we have at the moment. And the youth must be more and more interested in what is happening, because the future that is going to be shaped, the future of multilateralism, the future of the United Nations, is going to impact those who will be having to manage that future that will emerge. Just like the multipolar world that we are talking about, if we are showing no interest and making sure that we get involved in the discussions and demand to be consulted and be given a voice to express ourselves, because we will have to live with the consequences of the decisions that will have to be taken. And therefore, with the opening and the attitude that one sees in the continent of accepting youth and women participation at a different level, particularly young women in peace and security and youth in peace and security, and other forums, that the spaces that have been created, this is where we'll begin to influence these processes. And in our engagement with other youth from other continents on some of the global platforms that we have, we can, as an organized African voice of youth, add to whatever are the chances of getting a better deal out of these negotiations that are coming.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to open the floor for any questions that may be you would have wanted to ask. This is for the participants during the conversation. I've seen some on the chat box. I'll get to them after we take any hands. So let me go back once more. I see you've dropped your hand, Jimovi. Maybe your question was eventually asked,
No,
but if it
my mic is on now.
okay. So please briefly ask your question, and then I saw another hand. It also disappeared. I don't know what happened. So please go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, thank you, moderator. And the speaker, thank you very much for this elaborate journey back and then up to the present. I think initially I wanted to ask two questions, but somewhere along the line, one question was touched on. So I'm going to go for the second one, but it actually requires a backdrop. Initially, I wanted to say just the consensus, just 5 years into the consensus, 5, 6 years, by 2011, then we saw the case of Libya, which at that time we expect that the tempo of the consensus was still high, but yet the case of Libya, the invasion of Libya from the Security Council, NATO in particular, came up, and then Nigeria and South Africa present here, particularly, not without discountenance to the head Congo. That was the Gabon, sorry. So my question is, this same issue, the fact that we had Nigeria, South Africa present, also bespeaks to the very issue of the foundation or the founding of the United Nations, where you rightly mentioned we had 4 African quote and unquote representation there: South Africa, Egypt, Liberia, and Ethiopia, which for me, I think with the exception of Ethiopia and Egypt, South Africa, as we know then, was never a representation of Africa. It was the apartheid regime, which is itself a colonial power as at that point in time. Liberia has a manumitted status, which means it was actually an extension of United Nations as at that time. So we never had African representation, so to speak, in the founding of United Nations. And then that takes me to the actual question, which is, why do we still have ourselves dragging this consensus 20 years after in an institution that was formed by colonial powers? They drag us into war that was never our war. They say it was a world war. We lost life there. When it was time for Marshall Plan, we were not considered as part of it. That did not draw or make us to reflect enough we keep going into that same institution to plead as if we are begging to be given space in the Security Council that is dominated by the same people that created most of the problem, which, like you rightly adduced, most of the problems you are dealing with were created by the same people, and we are going to beg them to give us a seat in the organization they formed for themselves. And we expect them to give us space. Among the 5 permanent members we keep talking, with the exception of China and probably Russia, quote and unquote, these other 3 powers, especially United Kingdom and France, were the same colonial powers we have been dealing with, or that created most of the problems we have. Then till date, we see the problem going on in the Sahel right now. France never did left. Colonialism did not end in Africa with the continuation, the Pact for Continuation of Colonialism that was signed by Francophone West African, the Francophone state in West Africa. Yet we keep begging these same people in their own organization. So my question is, as an elder, and then we were talking of the future and how the youth can engage, should we still continue to work within the permits or the permissive structures that is created by the same structures and institutions or powers that created our problem? Or should we be thinking of an alternative mode of engagement? The policy crisis around the world today is already suggesting that multilateralism, as we know it, United Nations, is failing, is not sustainable. Can we begin to think of regional way of resolving our issue, instead of taking our problems to the same people that created the problem that still sat on the problem? Which kind of decision do we want to take in Africa, in United Nations today, with France present here, when you come to West Africa, for instance, and we expect that decision to scale through? So you, like you rightly cited with the case of veto, no veto, which was the initial position of the consensus, no veto at all. But within that same structure, is it feasible for us to continue this thing, or we should be thinking of operating outside the box created for us by the same structures that created the problem? So as an elder, I want you to help us, so that we can begin to know where to look at, instead of divesting our energy operating on the diktat or the trajectory that has been set for us by the same problems that created the problems, and we think to get the solution out of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
Thank you, Movi.
okay, thank you.
Ambassador Nhlapo, can I take one more question before you begin?
Okay.
Yeah. So we have another question from John Linus. Quickly, John, you have 30 seconds to ask your question or make your comment.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mike. John Linus. I'm visible. I'm audible.
Sorry, Stella, can you please mute? Okay, thank you, Stella. John?
Yeah, I'm saying I'm very much privileged to join you today, and thanks very much, Ambassador, for your insights. The question I have is that as Africans also, we have to be strategic and also structured, because acknowledging that, yeah, I can say that I'm privileged that right now I serve as one of the youth task force on Summit of the Future, advising the UN Secretary General. But the question I have for most of our Africans youth, the challenge is that we lack mentorship from those who come before us, because we strive to push and all these things. There are a lot of, we have to accept that the colonialism still exists. But how are we going to structure ourselves? How are we going to package ourselves in a way that we, even if we are reasoning, or even if we are brought on board to discuss all this how should I put it? To make sure that the voice of African youth are heard, or the voice of Africans are heard. But we still need a lot of restructuring and being intentional on exactly how we want our African people to be and what exactly we want as African. So thank you. I'm hoping to connect with a number of you here, but most importantly, how to bring as many youth as possible to this kind of invaluable conversations. Thanks very much, and back to you.
Thank you, John. So Ambassador Nhlapo, please go ahead. You have your...
Yeah, as I'm saying that, I'll start with John, that the attitude that is prevalent at the moment is, I think we need to take advantage of, because the space is being opened. The issue is how organized are the youth to take advantage of those spaces. One, you know, the recent meeting that took place in Dar es Salaam discussed some of these issues under the Mwalimu Nyerere Foundation and the Thabo Mbeki Foundation. An issue that arose was, what is the state of organization in the African continent? What happened to the formations that we've always had? The Pan-African Women's Organization, which was the first to be established even before the OAU. Where is it today? What is happening to it? The Organization of African Trade Union Unity. What's happening to OAU? Does it still exist? What are the issues that are being taken up there that are affecting the workers, and a lot of them who are young people? Even when you talk about women, a lot of them are young people. So the number increases when it comes to young people. The All Africa Students Union, it has been re-established, but where is it? What contribution is it making to raise the voice of the youth on some of the issues that contribute towards governance and shaping the future of the continent and our own countries, education, youth unemployment, all of those issues? Pan-African Youth Movement, it existed. It's been reorganized. All of these organizations are associate members of the African Union. They started with the OAU, and some incrementally became associate members and are integrated in the structures of the AU. And then you have the Women in Peace and the Security. So there's been an evolution. So what we need to do is to organize ourselves. The question we are raising is, how structured are we? Becomes an issue. Because as long as we are not structured, as long as we are not organized, as long as we don't have a collective voice, we are going to find ourselves continuously being marginalized. And you can see it happening on the country. That's number one. I think that's where the voice of the youth on that collective basis can be expressed. I'm saying the opportunities that are being created, let's take advantage of them. Now, on the question, you know, it's true. That's precisely the issue that is being raised at the moment, the nature of the United Nations and the fact that it still operates on the basis of its founding principles. When the international arrangements and the global position has shifted and continue to shift fundamentally, and that these structures that we've created, the multilateral institutions that have been created throughout the periods, and particularly after 1989, 1990, with the so-called New World Order, a lot has happened still, and a lot is happening now. The rise of China and some of the countries of the South coming together and challenging the hegemony of the West, and particularly the United States. We're talking about a possible emergence of a unipolar world, which we still have to define and define our place in it, so that history is not shaped for us, but we continue to shape it. Now, I'll take one example. peace and security budget of the AU. 95%, if not more now, comes from the development partners, and they are shifting away from their contributions. That dependency arises because we as Africans do not want to contribute towards funding the programs on the basis of which we have taken very good decisions on paper. But when it comes to implementation, we're hardly there. We are not funding our programs. Many countries continue to default. And that's why they even have to be sanctioned and punished and in different ways, because there's no level of commitment. It's very low. So we're still depending on these colonial powers and everyone else that is associated with the African continent in trying to help us deal with the challenges that we have. We look at what is happening in West Africa. Indeed, it's true, France was inked out, but we see Russia coming in. China, to some extent, also beginning to flex its muscles and replace the Western countries who have weakened and been kicked out on dealing with the hardcore issues of the rise in insurgencies. Right now, there's exercises that are taking place in Morocco, initiated by the United States and Britain, and with the participation of about 12 African countries. We were not coerced to go and participate. We were invited and we went and took part. We're taking part in a process that has always been divisive because they pick and choose who they relate to, who they assist in building a capacity to deal with the challenges that we're faced with. We allow it, and it continues to happen. So as long as we as Africans allow these situations to continue and we move on a basis of a weak position, we took a decision as a continent that no more again will we or our leaders be invited wholesale by one country. What happens when an invitation comes? They all go to China, all go to Russia, all go to France because it's no more only a Francophone show. Turkey can also convene us, we'll rush there. Others, anybody who wants to call Africa together, we go there. There's a US-Africa summit that is coming up. And it means that that's where we're going to end up. With the US as a group of countries, it has happened before under Biden, following the initiative by Clinton, who are being convened by individual countries, and they put to us their proposition. What happens in those meetings? We strike individual deals. Every country goes there and comes out very proudly with a deal with this particular country that has convened us, be it Japan, China, or whoever. That's what we are doing. So as long as we as Africans are not organized and continue to behave in a manner in which we are doing, and that if we take decisions, common African positions get broken precisely because of this dependency syndrome. So we need to get organized and Africans and be true to our decisions. The processes of reform of the AU and the funding issue, it started. We couldn't agree on a particular percentage from our tourism and other percentages being contributed to the peace fund so that we can fund our own peace and security operations. So we have to depend again on these former colonial powers to be the ones who are giving us the funding, and they decide where their contributions must go. We don't decide. They tell you we'll give you so much. They can quantify it in dollars or euros, but it could be equipment that we are not even able to use effectively because the situation that we are dealing with and the nature of the conflicts and the people who are driving them, because they've got access to resources and they can use drones or anything else, and they overpower our militaries because they are not adequately resourced. So I'm saying that instead of blaming other people, let's look at our own weaknesses. Let's look at ourselves and come to a conclusion as to what exactly are we doing about this situation. Let's implement our decisions. We've been talking about industrialization, does not happen. We've got a Pan-African Parliament, we've destroyed it, it's down on the ground. It cannot play the role that it's supposed to be playing. Completely weak. We're talking about free African trade. All the institutions that were created by the Lagos Plan of Action, the Abuja Treaty and the Lagos Plan of Action, including the African Economic Community, which was ratified and started meeting from 1994. It was meeting and stopped. That's why we are not dealing with integration on some of those issues, because we create institutions and abandon them. And the main reason why we do so, because we expect other people to fund them. And if they fund them, they control, pick and choose where their money must go.
That's true. And thank you very much, Ambassador Nhlapo. I think this discussion has been very insightful. Part one was mostly around, you know, what the consensus is about, where it started, talking all of that about the C10, the A3, getting to understand the process. But I think today, the discussion has given us a lot, it has shed a lot of light in terms of moving forward now. How do we move forward? How can we get involved, civil society, young people, and the like? And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everybody who's been with us. We've even gone way over time. Thank everybody who joined us. Thank you, especially Ambassador Nhlapo. You are always, eating up all the knowledge that you're always serving. And I hope to have many, many more conversations like this with you. And I've seen young people on the chat, they're very interested. And I think we should have our own consultation for young people on the Ezulwini Consensus, specifically to say, is it still relevant for you? The same way we did as the AU on the new agenda for peace, Summit of the Future, all of that. So I think that's something that we will start advocating for. So thank you very much. I will now hand back to Accord. I don't know who will be on the call to close for us and end the session for us officially. Thank you very much. My name once again is Mpule Kgetsi, the African Youth Ambassador for Peace for Southern Africa. It was lovely hosting you today.
Thank you very much, Mpule, and just to say a special thank you, of course, to Ambassador Nhlapo. I think everyone can agree that after talking to you, you leave a little bit smarter. So thank you for your time and sharing your insight. And of course, to Mpule, our Youth Ambassador for Peace, you've done such an excellent job moderating the conversation today and of course last week. And to all of you who've joined us online, thank you for spending your Friday morning or afternoon journeying with us through the Ezulwini Consensus, and in doing so exploring some of the issues around the historical struggle against colonial control, but also delving into the intricacies of global governance. And I know there were many young people on the call today, and I hope if you are IR scholars that you take this Ezulwini Consensus also as a really key example in building in the global governance architecture that's often based on the experiences and histories of Western countries. But here's something we can draw inspiration from, and also hoping that the same ideological gravitas and political integrity that guided the Ezulwini Consensus will somehow feed into how African member states approach multilateral reform. But yes, let's take the UN back to the people, as Ambassador Nhlapo called us to do, and let's be inspired by our history this Africa Month. So thank you once again, and have a good weekend. Bye-bye.